Good evening. I'm pleased to welcome you to Legacy Hall of the Creation Museum in Northern Kentucky in the metropolitan area of Cincinnati. I'm Tom Foreman from CNN, and I'm pleased to be tonight's moderator for this evolution versus creation debate. This is a very old question. Where did we come from? My answer is from Washington this morning by airplane. But there is a much more profound, longer answer that people have sought after for a long time. So tonight's question to be debated is the following. Is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? Our welcome extends to hundreds of thousands of people who are watching on the internet at debatelive.org. We're glad you have joined us. Of course, to our auditorium here, all of the folks have joined us as well. We're joined by 70 media representatives from many of the world's great news organizations. We're glad to have them here as well. And now let's welcome our debaters, Mr. Bill Nye and Mr. Ken Ham. We had a coin toss earlier to determine who would go first of these two men. The only thing missing was Joe Namath in a fur coat. But it went very well. Mr. Ham won the coin toss, and he opted to speak first. But first, let me tell you a little bit about both of these gentlemen. Mr. Nye's website describes him as a scientist, engineer, comedian, author, and inventor. Mr. Nye, as you may know, produced a number of award-winning TV shows, including the program he became so well known for, Bill Nye, the Science Guy. While working on the Science Guy show, Mr. Nye won 7 National Emmy Awards for writing, performing, and producing the show, won 18 Emmys in 5 years. In between creating the shows, he wrote 5 kids' books about science, including his latest title, Bill Nye's Great Big Book of Tiny Germs. Bill Nye is the host of 3 television series. His program, The 100 Greatest Discoveries, airs on the Science Channel. The Eyes of Nye airs on PBS stations across the country. He frequently appears on interview programs to discuss a variety of science topics. Mr. Nye serves as executive director of the Planetary Society, the world's largest space interest group. He is a graduate of Cornell with a Bachelor's of Science degree in mechanical engineering. Mr. Ken Ham is the president and co-founder of Answers in Genesis, a Bible-defending organization that upholds the authority of the scriptures from the very first verse. Mr. Ham is the man behind the popular high-tech Creation Museum where we're holding this debate. The museum has had 2 million visitors in 6 years and has attracted much of the world's media. The Answers in Genesis website is well trafficked with 2 million visitors alone last month. Mr. Ham is also a best-selling author, a much-in-demand speaker, and the host of a daily radio feature carried on 700-plus stations. This is his second public debate on evolution and creation. The first was at Harvard in the 1990s. Mr. Ham is a native of Australia. He earned a bachelor's degree in applied science with an emphasis in environmental biology from the Queensland Institute of Technology, as well as a diploma of education at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And now, Mr. Ham, you opted to go first, so you will be first with your 5-minute opening statement.
Well, good evening. I know that not everyone watching this debate will necessarily agree with what I have to say, but I'm an Aussie and live over here in America, and they tell me I have an accent, and so it doesn't matter what I say. Some people tell me, we just like to hear saying it. So I hope you enjoy me saying it anyway. Well, the debate topic is this: is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? You know, when this was first announced on the internet, there are lots of statements like this one from the Richard Dawkins Foundation: scientists should not debate creationists, period. And this one from one of the Discovery.com websites: should scientists debate creationists? You know, right here I believe there's a gross misrepresentation in our culture. We're seeing people in being indoctrinated to believe that creationists can't be scientists. I believe it's all a part of secularists hijacking the word science. I want you to meet a modern-day scientist who is a biblical creationist.
My name is Stuart Burgess. I'm a Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in the UK. My name is Stuart Burgess. I'm a Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in the UK. I have published over 130 scientific papers on the science of design in engineering and biological systems. From my research work, I have found that the scientific evidence fully supports creationism as the best explanation to origins. I've also designed major parts of spacecraft launched by Isso and NASA.
So here's a biblical creationist who's a scientist who's also an inventor. And I want young people to understand that. You know, the problem, I believe, is this. We need to define terms correctly. We need to define creation, evolution in regard to origins, and we need to define science. And in this opening statement, I want to concentrate on dealing with the word science. I believe the word science has been hijacked by secularists. Now, what is science? Well, the origin of the word comes from the classical Latin scientia, which means to know. And if you look up a dictionary, it'll say science means state of knowing, knowledge. But there's different types of knowledge, and I believe this is where the confusion lies. There's experimental or observational science, as we call it. That's using the scientific method, observation, measurement, experiment, testing. That's what produces our technology, computers, spacecraft, jet planes, smoke detectors, looking at DNA, antibiotics, medicines and vaccines. You see, all scientists, whether creationists or evolutionists, actually have the same observational or experimental science. And it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, you can be a great scientist. For instance, here's an atheist who is a great scientist, Craig Venter, one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. Or Dr. Raymond Damadian. He is a man who invented the MRI scanner and revolutionized medicine. He's a biblical creationist. But I want us to also understand molecules to man evolution belief has nothing to do with developing technology. You see, when we're talking about origins, we're talking about the past. We're talking about our origins. We weren't there. You can't observe that, whether it's molecules to man evolution or whether it's a creation account. When you're talking about the past, we like to call that origins or historical science, knowledge concerning the past. Here at the Creation Museum, we make no apology about the fact that our origins or historical science actually is based upon the biblical account of origins. Now, when you research science textbooks being used in public schools, what we found is this. By and large, their origins or historical science is based upon man's ideas about the past, for instance, the ideas of Darwin. And our research has found that public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational science and historical science. They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outlaw the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact. They are imposing, I believe, the religion of naturalism or atheism on generations of students. You see, I assert that the word science has been hijacked by secularists in teaching evolution to force the religion of naturalism on generations of kids. Secular evolutionists teach that all life developed by natural processes from some primordial form, that man is just an evolved animal, which has great bearing on how we view life and death. For instance, as Bill states,
it's very hard to accept for many of us that when you die, it's over.
But you see, the Bible gives a totally different account of origins, of who we are, where we came from, the meaning of life and our future. That through one man sin entered the world and death through sin, but that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whoever believes in him should not perish and have everlasting life. So, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? I say the creation-evolution debate is a conflict between two philosophical worldviews based on two different accounts of origins or science beliefs, and creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era.
And that is time. I have the unenviable job of being the timekeeper here. So I'm like the referee in football that you don't like, but I will periodically, if either one of our debaters runs over on anything, I will stop them in the name of keeping it fair for all. Mr. Ham, thank you for your comments. Now it's Mr. Nye's turn for a 5-minute opening statement. Mr. Nye.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate you including me in your facility here. Now, looking around the room, I think I see just one bow tie. Is that right? Just one. I'm telling you, once you try. Oh, yes, two. That's great. I started wearing bow ties when I was young in high school. My father showed me, his father showed him. And there's a story associated with this, which I find remarkable. My grandfather was in the Rotary, and he attended a convention in Philadelphia. And even in those days, at the turn of the last century, people rented tuxedos. And the tuxedo came with a bow tie, untied bow tie. So he didn't know how to tie it, so wasn't sure what to do, but he just took a chance. He went to the hotel room next door, knocked on the door, excuse me, can you help me tie my tie? And the guy said, sure, lie down on the bed. So my grandfather, wanted to have the tie on, wasn't sure what he was getting into, so he is said to have lain on the bed, and the guy tied a perfect bow tie knot, and quite reasonably, my grandfather said, thank you. Why'd I have to lie down on the bed? The guy said, I'm an undertaker. It's really the only way I know how to do it. Now, that story was presented to me as a true story. It may or may not be, but it gives you something to think about, and it's certainly something to remember. So here tonight, we're going to have two stories, and we can compare Mr. Ham's story to the story from what I will call the outside, from mainstream science. The question tonight is, does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So let me ask you all, what would you be doing if you weren't here tonight? That's right, you'd be home watching CSI. CSI Petersburg. Is that coming? I think it's coming. And on CSI, there is no distinction made between historical science and observational science. These are constructs unique to Mr. Ham. We don't normally have these anywhere in the world except here. Natural laws that applied in the past apply now. That's why they're natural laws. That's why we embrace them. That's how we made all these discoveries that enabled all this remarkable technology. So CSI is a fictional show, but it's based absolutely on real people doing real work. When you go to a crime scene and find evidence, you have clues about the past. And you trust those clues, and you embrace them, and you move forward to convict somebody. Mr. Ham and his followers have this remarkable view of a worldwide flood that somehow influenced everything that we observe in nature. A 500-foot wooden boat, 8 zookeepers for 14,000 individual animals, every land plant in the world underwater for a full year. I ask us all, is that really reasonable? You'll hear a lot about the Grand Canyon, I imagine, also, which is a remarkable place, and it has fossils. And the fossils in the Grand Canyon are found in layers. There is not a single place in the Grand Canyon where the fossils of one type of animal cross over into the fossils of another. In other words, when there was a big flood on the earth, you would expect drowning animals to swim up to a higher level. Not any one of them did. Not a single one. If you could find evidence of that, my friends, you could change the world. Now, I just want to remind us all, there are billions of people in the world who are deeply religious, who get enriched, who have a wonderful sense of community from their religion. They worship together, they eat together, they live in their communities and enjoy each other's company. Billions of people, but these same people do not embrace the extraordinary view that the earth is somehow only 6,000 years old. That is unique. And here's my concern. What keeps the United States ahead, what makes the United States a world leader, is our technology, our new ideas, our innovations. If we continue to eschew science, eschew the process, and try to divide science into observational science and historic science, we are not going to move forward. We will not embrace natural laws. We will not make discoveries. We will not invent and innovate and stay ahead. So if you ask me if Ken Ham's creation model is viable, I say no. It is absolutely not viable. So stay with us over the next period, and you can compare my evidence to his. Thank you all very much.
Very nice start by both of our debaters here. And now each one will offer a 30-minute illustrated presentation to fully offer their case for us to consider. Mr. Ham, you're up.
Well, the debate topic was, is creation a viable model of origins in today's modern scientific era? And I made this statement at the end of my opening statement. Creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era. And I said, what we need to be doing is actually defining our terms, and particularly three terms: science, creation, and evolution. Now, I discussed the meaning of the word science and what is meant by experimental or observational science briefly, and that both creationists and evolutionists can be great scientists, for instance. I mentioned Craig Venter, a biologist. He's an atheist, and he's a great scientist. He was one of the first researchers to sequence the human genome. I also mentioned Dr. Raymond Damadian, who actually invented the MRI scanner. I want you to meet a biblical creationist who is a scientist and inventor.
Hi, my name is Dr. Raymond Damadian. I am a young Earth creation scientist and believe that God created the world in 6 24-hour days, just as recorded in the book of Genesis. By God's grace and the devoted prayers of my godly mother-in-law, I invented the MRI scanner in 1969. The idea that scientists who believe the Earth is 6,000 years old cannot do real science is simply wrong.
Well, he's most adamant about that. And actually, he revolutionized medicine. He's a biblical creationist. And I encourage children to follow people like that and make them their heroes. Let me introduce you to another biblical creation scientist.
My name is Danny Faulkner. I received my PhD in astronomy from Indiana University. For 26 and a half years, I was professor at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where I hold the rank of Distinguished Professor Emeritus. Upon my retirement from the university in January of 2013, I joined the research staff at Answers in Genesis. I'm a stellar astronomer. That means my primary interest is stars, but I'm particularly interested in the study of eclipsing binary stars. And I've published many articles in the astronomy literature, places such as the Astrophysical Journal, the Astronomical Journal, and the Observatory. There is nothing in observational astronomy that contradicts a recent creation.
I also mentioned Dr. Stuart Burgess, Professor of Engineering Design at Bristol University in England. Now, he designed a double-action worm gear set for the 3 hinges of the robotic arm on a very expensive satellite. And if that had not worked, if that gear set had not worked, that whole satellite would have been useless. Yet Dr. Burgess is a biblical creationist who believes just as I believe. Now, think about this for a moment. Are scientists like Dr. Burgess, who believe in creation, just as I do, a small minority in the scientific world? But let's see what he says about scientists believing in creation.
I find that many of my colleagues in academia are sympathetic to the creationist viewpoint, including biologists. However, they are often afraid to speak out because of the criticisms they would get from the media and atheist lobby.
I agree, that's a real problem today. We need to have freedom to be able to speak on these topics. You know, I just want to say, by the way, that non-Christian scientists, I should say, non-Christian scientists are really borrowing from the Christian worldview anyway to carry out their experimental or observational science. Think about it. When they're doing observational science using the scientific method, they have to assume the laws of logic, they have to assume the laws of nature, they have to assume the uniformity of nature. I mean, think about it. If the universe came about by natural processes, where'd the laws of logic come from? Did they just pop into existence? Are we in a stage now where we only have half logic? So you see, I have a question for Bill Nye. How do you account for the laws of logic and the laws of nature from a naturalistic worldview that excludes the existence of God? Now, in my opening statement, I also discussed a different type of science or knowledge, origins or historical science. See, again, there's a confusion here, there's a misunderstanding here. People, by and large, have not been taught to look at what you believe about the past as different to what you're observing in the present. You don't observe the past directly. Even when you think about the creation account, I mean, we can't observe God creating. We can't observe the creation of Adam and Eve. We admit that. We're willing to admit our beliefs about the past. But see, what you see in the present is very different. Even some public school textbooks, actually, well, they sort of acknowledge the difference between historical and observational science. Here is an earth science textbook that's used in public schools, and we read this. In contrast to physical geology, the aim of historical geology is to understand Earth's long history. And then they make the statement, historical geology, so we're talking about historical science, tries to establish a timeline of the vast number of physical and biological changes that have occurred in the past. We study physical geology before historical geology because we first must understand how Earth works before we try to unravel its past. In other words, we observe things in the present and then, okay, we're assuming that that's always happened in the past and we're going to try and figure out how this happened. See, there is a difference between what you observe and what happened in the past. Let me illustrate it this way. If Bill Nye and I went to the Grand Canyon, we could agree that that's a Coconino sandstone in the Hermit Shale, and there's the boundary. They're sitting one on top of the other. We could agree on that. But do you know what we would disagree on? I mean, we could even analyse the minerals and agree on that. But we would disagree on how long it took to get there. But see, none of us saw the sandstone or the shale being laid down. There's a supposed 10 million year gap there, but I don't see a gap. But that might be different to what Bill Nye would see. But see, there's a difference between what you actually observe directly and then your interpretation in regard to the past. When I was at the Goddard Space Centre a number of years ago, I met creationists and evolutionists who were both working on the Hubble telescope. They agreed on how to build the Hubble telescope. You know what they disagreed on? Well, they disagreed on how to interpret the data that telescope obtained in regard to the age of the universe. And, you know, we could go on and talk about lots of other similar sorts of things. For instance, I've heard Bill Nye talk about how a smoke detector works using the radioactive element americium. And you know what? I totally agree with him on that. We agree how it works. We agree how radioactivity enables that to work. But if you're then going to use radioactive elements and talk about the age of the Earth, you've got a problem because you weren't there. We've got to understand parent elements, daughter elements, and so on. We could agree whether you're a creationist or evolutionist on the technology to put the rover on Mars, but we're going to disagree on how to interpret the origin of Mars. I mean, there are some people that believe there was even a global flood on Mars and there's no liquid water on Mars. But, you know, we're going to disagree maybe on our interpretation of origins, and you can't prove either way because, not from an observational science perspective, because we've only got the present. Creationists and evolutionists both work on medicines and vaccines. You see, it doesn't matter whether you're a creationist or an evolutionist, all scientists have the same experimental or observational science. So I have a question for Bill Nye. Can you name one piece of technology that could only have been developed starting with a belief in molecules to man evolution? Now, here's another important fact. Creationists and evolutionists all have the same evidence. Bill Nye and I have the same Grand Canyon. We don't disagree on that. We will have the same fish fossil. This is one from the Creation Museum. The same dinosaur skeletons, the same animals, the same humans, the same DNA, the same radioactive decay elements that we see. We have the same universe. Actually, we all have the same evidences. It's not the evidences that are different. It's a battle over the same evidence in regard to how we interpret the past. And you know why that is? Because it's really a battle over worldviews and starting points. It's a battle over philosophical worldviews and starting points, but the same evidence. Now, I admit my starting point is that God is the ultimate authority. But if someone doesn't accept that, then man has to be the ultimate authority. And that's really the difference when it comes down to it. You see, I've been emphasising the difference between historical origin science, knowledge about the past when you weren't there, and we need to understand that we weren't there, or experimental or observational science, using your five senses in the present, the scientific method, what you can directly observe, test, repeat. There's a big difference between those two. And that's not what's being taught in our public schools, and that's why kids aren't being taught to think critically and correctly about the origins issue. But you know, it's also important to understand, when talking about creation and evolution, both involve historical science and observational science. You see, the role of observational science is this: it can be used to confirm or otherwise one's historical science based on one's starting point. Now, when you think about the debate topic and what I affirmed concerning creation, if our origins or historical science based on the Bible's account of origins is true, then there should be predictions from this that we can test using observational science, and there are. For instance, based on the Bible, we'd expect to find evidence confirming an intelligence produced life. We'd expect to find evidence confirming after their kind. The Bible says God made kinds of animals and plants after their kind, implying each kind produces its own, not that one kind changes into another. You'd expect to find evidence confirming a global flood of Noah's day, evidence confirming one race of humans, because we all go back to Adam and Eve. Biologically, that would mean there's one race. evidence confirming the Tower of Babel, that God gave different languages, evidence confirming a young universe. Now, I can't go through all of those, but a couple of them we'll look at briefly. After their kind, evidence confirming that. In the Creation Museum, we have a display featuring replicas, actually, of Darwin's finches. They're called Darwin's finches. Darwin collected finches from the Galapagos and took them back to England, and we see the different species, the different beak sizes here. And you know, from the specimens that Darwin obtained in the Galapagos, he actually pondered these things and how do you explain this? And in his notes, actually, he came up with this diagram here, a tree. And he actually said, I think. So he was talking about different species and maybe those species came from some common ancestor. Actually, when it comes to finches, we actually would agree as creationists that different finch species came from a common ancestor, but a finch is what they would have to come from. But you see, Darwin wasn't just thinking about species. Darwin had a much bigger picture in mind. When you look at The Origin of Species and read that book, you'll find he made this statement: from such low and intermediate form, both animals and plants may have been developed, and if we admit this, we must likewise admit that all organic beings which have ever lived on this earth may be descended from some one primordial form. So he had in mind what we today know as an evolutionary tree of life, that all life has arisen from some primordial form. Now, when you consider the classification system, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, we would say, as creationists, and we have many creation scientists who've researched this, and for lots of reasons, I would say the kind in Genesis 1 really is more at the family level of classification. For instance, there's one dog kind, there's one cat kind, even though you have different genera, different species. That would mean, by the way, you didn't need anywhere near the number of animals on the ark as people think. You wouldn't need all the species of dogs, just two, not all the species of cats, just two. And you see, based on the biblical account there in Genesis 1, creationists have drawn up what they believe is a creation orchard. In other words, they're saying, look, there's great variation in the genetics of dogs and finches and so on. And so over time, particularly after Noah's flood, you'd expect if there were two dogs, for instance, you could end up with different species of dogs because there's an incredible amount of variability in the genes of any creature. And so you'd expect these different species up here, but there's limits. Dogs will always be dogs, finches will always be finches. Now, as a creationist, I maintain that observational science actually confirms this model based on the Bible. For instance, take dogs. Okay, in a scientific paper dated January 2014, that's this year, scientists working at the University of California stated this: we provide several lines of evidence supporting a single origin for dogs and disfavouring alternative models in which dog lineages arise separately from geographically distinct wolf populations. And they put this diagram in the paper. By the way, that diagram is very, very similar to this diagram that creationists proposed based upon the creation account in Genesis. In other words, you have a common dog ancestor that gives rise to the different species of dogs, and that's exactly what we're saying here. Now, in the Creation Museum, we actually show the finches here, and you can see the finches with their different beaks beside dog skulls, different species of dogs. By the way, there's more variation in the dog skulls here than there are in these finches. Yet the dogs, well, that's never used as an example of evolution, but the finches are, particularly in the public school textbooks. Students are taught, see the changes that are occurring here? And here's another problem that we've got. Not only has the word science been hijacked by secularists, I believe the word evolution has been hijacked by secularists. The word evolution has been hijacked using what I call a bait and switch. Let me explain to you. The word evolution is being used in public school textbooks, and we often see it in documentaries and so on. It's used for observable changes that we would agree with, and then used for unobservable changes, such as molecules to man. Let me explain to you what's really going on, because I was a science teacher in the public schools, and I know what the students were taught, and I check the public school textbooks anyway to know what they're taught. See, students are taught today, look, there's all these different animals, plants, but they're all part of this great big tree of life that goes back to some primordial form. And look, we see changes in finches, changes in dogs, and so on. Now, we don't deny the changes. You see that. You see different species of finches, different species of dogs. But then they put it all together in this evolutionary tree, but that's what you don't observe. You don't observe that. That's belief there. That's their historical science. that I would say was wrong. But you know what you do observe? You do observe different species of dogs, different species of finches, but then there are limits, and you don't see one kind changing into another. Actually, we're told that if you teach creation in the public schools, that's teaching religion. If you teach evolution, that's science. And I'm going to say, wait a minute. Actually, the creation model here, based upon the Bible, observational science confirms this. This is what you observe. You don't observe this tree. Actually, it's the public school textbooks that are teaching a belief, imposing it on students, and they need to be teaching them observational science to understand the reality of what's happening. Now, what we found is that public school textbooks present the evolutionary tree as science, but reject the creation orchard as religion. But observational science confirms the creation orchard. So public school textbooks are rejecting observational science and imposing a naturalistic religion on students. The word evolution has been hijacked using a bait and switch to indoctrinate students to accept evolutionary belief as observational science. Let me introduce you to another scientist, Richard Lenski, Michigan State University. He's a great scientist. He's known for culturing E. coli in the lab. And he found there were some E. coli that actually seemed to develop the ability to grow on substrate, on citrate in substrate. But Richard Lenski is here mentioned in this book, and it's called Evolution in the Lab. So the ability to grow on citrate is said to be evolution. And there are those that say, hey, this is against the creationists. For instance, Jerry Coyne from University of Chicago says, Lenski's experiment is also yet another poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists. He says the thing I like most is that it says you can get these complex traits evolving by a combination of unlikely events. But is it a poke in the eye for anti-evolutionists? Is it really seeing complex traits evolving? What does it mean that some of these bacteria are able to grow on citrate? Let me introduce you to another biblical creationist who is a scientist.
Hi, my name is Dr. Andrew Fabich. I got my PhD from the University of Oklahoma in microbiology. I teach at Liberty University, and I do research on E. coli in the intestine. I've published in secular journals from the American Society for Microbiology, including infection immunity and applied environmental microbiology, as well as several others. My work has been cited even the past year in the journals Nature, Science Translational Medicine, Public Library of Science, Public Library of Science Genetics. It's cited regularly in those journals. And while I was taught nothing but evolution, I don't accept that position, and I do my research from a creation perspective. When I look at the evidence that people cite of E. coli supposedly evolving over 30 years, over 30,000 generations in the lab, and people say that it is now able to grow on citrate, I don't deny that it grows on citrate, but it's not any kind of new information. The information's already there, and it's just a switch that gets turned on and off, and that's what they reported in there. There's nothing new.
See, students need to be told what's really going on here. Certainly there's change, but it's not change necessary from molecules to man. Now, we could look at other predictions. What about evidence confirming one race? Well, when we look at the human population, we see lots of differences. But based on Darwin's ideas of human evolution as presented in The Descent of Man, I mean, Darwin did teach in The Descent of Man there were lower races and higher races. Would you believe that back in the 1900s, one of the most popular biology textbooks used in the public schools in America taught this? At the present time, there exist upon Earth 5 races, or varieties of man, and finally the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. Can you imagine if that was in the public schools today? And yet, that's what was taught, but it was based on Darwin's ideas that are wrong. You have a wrong foundation. You're going to have a wrong worldview. Now, had they started from the Bible and from the creation account in the Bible, what does it teach? Well, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We go through the Tower of Babel, different languages, so different people groups formed, distinct characteristics, but we'd say, you know what, that means there's biologically only one race of humans. Well, I mentioned Dr. Venter before, and he was a researcher with the Human Genome Project, and you'll remember in the year 2000, this was headline news, and what we read was this: they had put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome and unanimously declared there is only one race, the human race. Wow, who would have guessed? But you see, there we have observational science confirming the creation account, not confirming at all Darwin's ideas. Now, there's much more that could be said on each of these topics. Obviously, you can't do that in a short time like this, and you could do a lot more research. I suggest you visit our website at Answers in Genesis for a lot more information. So, the debate topic, is creation a viable model of origins in today's scientific era? I said we need to define the terms, and particularly the term science and the term evolution, and I believe we need to understand how they're being used to impose an anti-God religion on generations of unsuspecting students. You see, I keep emphasising we do need to understand the difference between experimental or observational science and historical science. And you know what? The secularists don't like me doing this because they don't want to admit that there's a belief aspect to what they're saying, and there is, and they can't get away from it. Let me illustrate this with a statement from Bill Nye.
That you can show the Earth is not flat. You can show the Earth is not 10,000 years old.
By the way, I agree. You can show the Earth is not flat. There's a video from the Galileo spacecraft showing the Earth, and speeded up, of course, but spinning. You can see it's a sphere. You can observe that. You can't observe the age of the Earth. You don't see that. You see, again, I emphasise there's a big difference between historical science, talking about the past, and observational science, talking about the present. And I believe what's happening is this, that students are being indoctrinated by the confusion of terms. The hijacking of the word science and the hijacking of the word evolution in a bait and switch. Let me illustrate further with this video clip, because here I assert that Bill Nye is equating observational science with historical science, and I also say it's not a mystery when you understand the difference.
Apparently, people with these deeply held religious beliefs, they embrace that whole literal interpretation of the Bible as written in English as a worldview, and at the same time, they accept aspirin, antibiotic drugs, airplanes, but they're able to hold these two worldviews, and this is a mystery.
Actually, I suggest to you it's not a mystery. You see, when I'm talking about antibiotics, aspirin, smoke detectors, jet planes, that's Ken Ham, the observational science bloke. I'm an Australian. We call guys blokes, okay? But when you're talking about creation in thousands of years or the age of the Earth, that's Ken Ham, the historical science bloke. I'm willing to admit that. Now, when Bill Nye's talking about aspirin, antibiotics, jet planes, smoke detectors, he does a great job at that. I used to enjoy watching him on TV too. That's Bill Nye, the observational science guy. But when he's talking about evolution of millions of years, I'm challenging him that that's Bill Nye, the historical science guy, and I challenge the evolutionists to admit the belief aspects of their particular worldview. Now, at the Creation Museum, we're only too willing to admit our beliefs based upon the Bible, but we also teach people the difference between beliefs and what one can actually observe and experiment with in the present. I believe we're teaching people to think critically and to think in the right terms about science. I believe it's the creationists that should be educating the kids out there, because we're teaching them the right way to think. You know, we admit our origins of historical science is based upon the Bible, but I'm just challenging evolutionists to admit the belief aspects of evolution and be upfront about the difference here. As I said, I'm only too willing to admit my historical science based on the Bible. And let me further go on and define the term creation as we use it. By creation, we mean, here at Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum, we mean the account based on the Bible. Yes, I take Genesis as literal history, as Jesus did. And here at the Creation Museum, we walk people through that history. We walk them through creation, a perfect creation. God made Adam and Eve, land animal kind, sea creatures, and so on. And then sin and death entered the world, so there was no death before sin. That means, how can you have billions of dead things before man sinned? And then the catastrophe of Noah's flood. If there was a global flood, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Had to say that because a lot of our supporters would want me to. And what do you find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Confusion, the Tower of Babel. God gave different languages, so you get different people groups. So this is the geological, astronomical, anthropological, biological history as recorded in the Bible. So this is concerning what happened in the past that explains the present. And then, of course, that God's Son stepped into history to be Jesus Christ, the God-man, to die on a cross, be raised from the dead, and one day there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth to come. And, you know, not only is this an understanding of history to explain the geology, biology, astronomy, and so on to connect the present to the past, but it's also a foundation for our whole worldview. For instance, in Matthew 19, when Jesus was asked about marriage, he said, "Have you not read? He which made the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they'll be one flesh." He quoted from Genesis as literal history, Genesis 1 and 2. God invented marriage, by the way. That's where marriage comes from, and it's to be a man and a woman. And not only marriage, ultimately, every single biblical doctrine of theology, directly or indirectly, is founded in Genesis. Why is there sin in the world? Genesis. Why is there death? Genesis. Why do we wear clothes? Genesis. Why did Jesus die on a cross? Genesis. It's a very important book. It's foundational to all Christian doctrine. And you see, when we look at that, what I call the 7 C's of history that we walk people through here at the museum, think about how it all connects together. A perfect creation, it'll be perfect again in the future. Sin and death entered the world. That's why God's Son died on the cross, and to conquer death and offer a free gift of salvation. The flood of Noah's day, a reminder that the flood was a judgment because of man's wickedness, but at the same time a message of God's grace and salvation, as Noah and his family had to go through a door to be saved, so we need to go through a door to be saved. Jesus Christ said, "I am the door, by me if any man enter in, he'll be saved." And we make no apology about the fact that what we're on about is this. If you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart God has raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Now, as soon as I say that, people say, see, if you allow creation in schools, for instance, if you allow students to even hear about it, this is religion. You know, let me illustrate this, talking about a recent battle in Texas over textbooks in the public school. A newspaper report said this: textbook and classroom curriculum battles have long ranged in Texas, pitting creationists, those who see God's hand in the creation of the universe, against academics. Stop right there. Notice, creationists, academics. Creationists can't be academics. Creationists can't be scientists. See, it's the way things are worded out there. It's an indoctrination that's going on, who worry about religious and political ideology trumping scientific fact. Wait a minute, what do they mean by science? You're talking about what you observe, or you're talking about your beliefs about the past? Now, Kathy Miller is the president of the Texas Freedom Network, and she's vocally spoken out. She's spoken out about this textbook battle there in Texas. And the mission statement of the organisation she's president of says, the Texas Freedom Network advances a mainstream agenda of religious freedom and individual liberties to counter the religious right. Religious freedom, individual liberties. And then she makes this statement: science education, what does she mean by science, should be based on mainstream science education, not on personal ideological beliefs of unqualified reviewers. Wait a minute, they want religious liberty and not personal ideological beliefs? I assert this. Public school textbooks are using the same word science for observational and historical science. They arbitrarily define science as naturalism and outlaw the supernatural. They present molecules to man evolution as fact, and they're imposing the religion of naturalism on generations of students. They're imposing their ideology on the students, that everything's explained by natural processes. That is a religion. What does she mean by religious liberty? They tolerate their religion. See, the battle is really about authority. It's more than just science or evolution or creation. It's about who is the authority in this world, man or God. If you start with naturalism, then what about morals? Who decides right and wrong? Well, it's subjective. Marriage, well, whatever you want it to be. Get rid of old people. I mean, why not? I mean, they're just animals. They're costing us a lot of money. Abortion, get rid of spare cats, get rid of spare kids. We're all animals. But if you start from God's word, there are moral absolutes. God decides right and wrong. Marriage, one man and one woman. Sanctity of life. We care for old people. They're made in the image of God. Life begins at fertilization, so abortion is killing a human being. We do see the collapse of Christian morality in our culture and increasing moral relativism because generations of kids are being taught the religion of naturalism and that the Bible can't be trusted. And so again I say, creation is the only viable model of historical science confirmed by observational science in today's modern scientific era. You know what? I'm a science teacher. I want to see kids taught science. I love science. I want to see more Dr. Demadians in the world. You know, if we teach them the whole universe is a result of natural processes and not designed by a creator God, they might be looking in the wrong places or have the wrong idea when they're looking at the creation in regard to how you develop technology, because if they look on it as just random processes, that could totally influence the way they think. If they understand it was a perfect world marred by sin, that could have a great effect on how they then look for overcoming diseases and problems in the world. I want children to be taught the right foundation, that there's a God who created them, who loves them, who died on the cross for them, and that they're special. They're made in the image of God.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Ham. We can applaud Mr. Ham's presentation. And you know, it did occur to me when you had my old friend Larry King up there, you could have just asked him. He's been around a long time, and he's a smart guy. He could probably answer for all of us. Now, let's all be attentive to Mr. Nye as he gives us his 30-minute presentation.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ham, I learned something. Thank you. But let's take it back around to the question at hand. Does Ken Ham's creation model hold up? Is it viable? So for me, of course, well, take a look. We're here in Kentucky on layer upon layer upon layer of limestone. I stopped at the side of the road today and picked up this piece of limestone that has a fossil right there. Now, in these many, many layers, in this vicinity of Kentucky, there are coral animals, fossil, zooxanthellae. And when you look at it closely, you can see that they live their entire lives. They lived typically 20 years, sometimes more than that, if the water conditions are correct. And so we are standing on millions of layers of ancient life. How could those animals have lived their entire life and formed these layers in just 4,000 years? There isn't enough time since Mr. Ham's flood for this limestone that we're standing on to have come into existence. My scientific colleagues go to places like Greenland, the Arctic, they go to Antarctica, and they drill into the ice with hollow drill bits. It's not that extraordinary. Many of you have probably done it yourselves, drilling other things, hole saws to put locks in doors, for example. And we pull out long cylinders of ice, long ice rods. And these are made of snow. And by a long tradition, it's called snow ice. And snow ice forms over the winter as snowflakes fall and are crushed down by subsequent layers. They're crushed together and trapping the little bubbles. And the little bubbles must needs be ancient atmosphere. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle squirting ancient atmosphere into the bubbles. And we find certain of these cylinders to have 680,000 layers. 680,000 snow, winter, summer cycles. How could it be that just 4,000 years ago, all of this ice formed? Let's just run some numbers. This is some scenes from lovely Antarctic. Let's say we have 680,000 layers of snow ice and 4,000 years since the Great Flood. That would mean we'd need 170 winter, summer cycles every year for the last 4,000 years. I mean, wouldn't someone have noticed that? Wow. Wouldn't someone have noticed that there's been winter, summer 170 times one year? If we go to California, we find enormous stands of bristlecone pines. Some of them are over 6,000 years old, 6,800 years old. There's a famous tree in Sweden, Old Tycho, is 9,550 years old. How could these trees be there if there was an enormous flood just 4,000 years ago? You can try this yourself, everybody. I don't mean to be mean to trees, but get a sapling and put it underwater for a year. It will not survive in general, nor will its seeds. They just won't make it. So how could these trees be that old if the earth is only 4,000 years old? Now, when we go to the Grand Canyon, which is an astonishing place, and I recommend to everybody in the world to someday visit the Grand Canyon, you find layer upon layer of ancient rocks. And if there was this enormous flood that you speak of, wouldn't there have been churning and bubbling and roiling? How would these things have settled out? Your claim that they settled out in an extraordinary short amount of time is, for me, not satisfactory. You can look at these rocks, you can look at rocks that are younger, you can go to seashores where there's sand. This is what geologists on the outside do, study the rate at which soil is deposited at the end of rivers and deltas, and we can see that it takes a long, long time for sediments to turn to stone. Also, in this picture, you can see where one type of sediment has intruded on another type. Now, if that was uniform, wouldn't we expect it all to be even without intrusion? Furthermore, you can find places in the Grand Canyon where you see an ancient riverbed on that side going to an ancient riverbed on that side, and the Colorado River has cut through it. And by the way, if this great flood drained through the Grand Canyon, wouldn't there have been a Grand Canyon on every continent? How could we not have Grand Canyons everywhere if this water drained away in this extraordinary short amount of time, 4,000 years? Now, when you look at these layers carefully, you find these beautiful fossils. And when I say beautiful, I am inspired by them. They're remarkable because we are looking at the past. You find down low, you'll find what you might consider as rudimentary sea animals. Up above, you'll find the famous trilobites. Above that, you might find some clams, some oysters. And above that, you'll find some mammals. You never, ever find a higher animal mixed in with a lower one. You never find a lower one trying to swim its way to the higher one. If it all happened in such an extraordinary short amount of time, if this water drained away just like that, wouldn't we expect to see some turbulence? And by the way, anyone here, really, if you can find one example of that anywhere in the world, the scientists of the world challenge you. They would embrace you. You would be a hero. You would change the world if you could find one example of that anywhere. People have looked and looked and looked. They have not found a single one. Now, here's an interesting thing. These are fossil skulls that people have found all around the world. It's by no means representative of all the fossil skulls that have been found, but these are all over the place. Now, if you were to look at these, I can assure you not any of them is a gorilla, right? If, as Mr. Ham and his associates claim, there was just man and then everybody else, there were just humans and all other species, where would you put modern humans among these skulls? How did all these skulls get all over the earth in these extraordinary fashion? Where would you put us? Well, I can tell you we are on there, and I encourage you, when you go home, to look it up. Now, one of the extraordinary claims associated with Mr. Ham's worldview is that this giant boat, very large wooden ship, went aground safely on a mountain in the Middle East, what we now call the Middle East. And so places like Australia are populated then by animals who somehow managed to get from the Middle East all the way to Australia in the last 4,000 years. Now, that to me is an extraordinary claim. We would expect then, somewhere between the Middle East and Australia, we would expect to find evidence of kangaroos. We would expect to find some fossils, some bones. In the last 4,000 years, somebody would have been hopping along there and died along the way, and we'd find them. And furthermore, there's a claim that there was a land bridge that allowed these animals to get from Asia all the way to the continent of Australia, and that land bridge has disappeared in the last 4,000 years. No navigator, no diver, no U.S. Navy submarine, no one's ever detected any evidence of this, let alone any fossils of kangaroos. So your expectation is not met. It doesn't seem to hold up. So let's see, if there are 4,000 years since Ken Ham's flood, and let's say, as he said many times, there are 7,000 kinds. Today, the very, very lowest estimate is that there are about 8.7 million species. But a much more reasonable estimate is it's 50 million or even 100 million when you start counting the viruses and the bacteria and all the beetles that must be extant in the tropical rainforest that we haven't found. So we'll take a number which I think is pretty reasonable, 16 million species today, okay? If these came from 7,000 kinds, that's, let's say we have 7,000 subtracted from 15 million, that's 15,993. We have 4,000 years, we have 365 and a quarter days a year. We would expect to find 11 new species every day. So you'd go out into your yard, you wouldn't just find a different bird, a new bird, you'd find a different kind of bird, a whole new species of bird every day, a new species of fish, a new species of organisms you can't see, and so on. I mean, this would be enormous news. The last 4,000 years, people would have seen these changes among us. So the Cincinnati Enquirer, I imagine, would carry a column right next to the weather report. Today's new species, and it would list these 11 every day. But we see no evidence of that. There's no evidence of these species. There just simply isn't enough time. Now, as you may know, I was graduated from engineering school, and I got a job at Boeing. I worked on 747s. Okay, everybody relax. I was very well supervised. Everything's fine. There's a tube in the 747 I kind of think of as my tube. But that aside, I traveled the highways of Washington State quite a bit. I was a young guy. I had a motorcycle. I used to go mountain climbing in Washington State, Oregon. And you can drive along and find these enormous boulders on top of the ground. Enormous rocks, huge, sitting on top of the ground. Now, out there in regular academic pursuits, regular geology, people have discovered that there used to be a lake in what is now Montana, which we charmingly refer to as Lake Missoula. It's not there now, but the evidence for it, of course, is, if I may, overwhelming. And so an ice dam would form at Lake Missoula, and once in a while it would break. It would build up and break, and there were multiple floods in my old state of Washington State. And just before we go on, let me just say, go Seahawks. That was very gratifying for me. Anyway, you drive along the road, and there are these rocks. So if, as is asserted here at this facility, that the heavier rocks would sink to the bottom during a flood event, the big rocks, and especially their shape, instead of aerodynamic, the hydrodynamic, the water-changing shape, as water flows past. You'd expect them to sink to the bottom. But here are these enormous rocks right on the surface, and there's no shortage of them. If you go driving in Washington State or Oregon, they're readily available. So how could those be there if the Earth is just 4,000 years old? How could they be there if this one flood caused that? Another remarkable thing I'd like everybody to consider, inherent in this worldview, is that somehow Noah and his family were able to build a wooden ship that would house 14,000 individuals. There were 7,000 kinds, and there's a boy and a girl for each one of those. So it's about 14,008 people. And these people were unskilled. As far as anybody knows, they had never built a wooden ship before. Furthermore, they had to get all these animals on there, and they had to feed them, and I understand that Mr. Ham has some explanations for that, which I frankly find extraordinary, but this is the premise of the bit. And we can then run a test, a scientific test. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinary large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built. It had a motor on it for winching cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way. And in all that twisting, it leaked. It leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very, very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding. And they couldn't build a boat as big as the Ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world couldn't do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do. If you visit the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., it's 163 acres, and they have 400 species. By the way, this picture that you're seeing was taken by spacecraft in space, orbiting the Earth. If you told my grandfather, let alone my father, that we had that capability, they would have been amazed. That capability comes from our fundamental understanding of gravity, of material science, of physics, and life science, where you go looking. This place is often, as any zoo, is often deeply concerned and criticized for how it treats its animals. They have 400 species on 163 acres, 66 hectares. Is it reasonable that Noah and his colleagues, his family, were able to maintain 14,000 animals and themselves and feed them aboard a ship that was bigger than anyone's ever been able to build? Now, here's the thing. What we want in science, science as practiced out on the outside, is an ability to predict. We want to have a natural law that is so obvious and clear, so well understood, that we can make predictions about what will happen. We can predict that we can put a spacecraft in orbit and take a picture of Washington, D.C. We can predict that if we provide this much room for an elephant, it will live healthily for a certain amount of time. So I'll give you an example. In the explanation provided by traditional science of how we came to be, we find, as Mr. Ham alluded to many times in his recent remarks, we find a sequence of animals in what generally is called the fossil record. This would be to say, when we look at the layers that you would find in Kentucky, you look at them carefully, you find a sequence of animals, a succession. And as one might expect, when you're looking at old records, there's some pieces seem to be missing, a gap. So scientists got to thinking about this. There are lungfish that jump from pond to pond in Florida and end up in people's swimming pools. And there are amphibians, frogs and toads, croaking and carrying on. And so people wondered if there wasn't a fossil or an organism, an animal that had lived, that had characteristics of both. People over the years had found that in Canada, there was clearly a fossil marsh, a place that used to be a swamp, had dried out. And they found all kinds of happy swamp fossils there, ferns, so on, and organisms, animals, fish that were recognized. And people realized that if this, with the age of the rocks there, as computed by traditional scientists, with the age of the rocks there, this would be a reasonable place to look for an animal, a fossil of an animal that lived there. And indeed, scientists found it, Tiktaalik, this fish lizard guy. And they found several specimens. It wasn't one individual. In other words, they made a prediction that this animal would be found, and it was found. So far, Mr. Ham and his worldview, the Ken Ham creation model, does not have this capability. It cannot make predictions and show results. Here's an extraordinary one that I find remarkable. There are certain fish, the top minnows, that have the remarkable ability to have sex with other fish, traditional fish sex, and they can have sex with themselves. Now, one of the old questions in life science, everybody, one of the old sort of chin strokers, is why does any organism, whether you're an ash tree, a sea jelly, a squid, a marmot, why does anybody have sex? I mean, there are more bacteria in your tummy right now than there are humans on Earth. And bacteria, they don't bother with that, man. They just like split themselves in half. They get new bacteria. Like, let's get her done. Let's go. But why does think of all the trouble a rose bush goes to make a flower, and the thorns and the bees swimming, flying around, interacting. Why does anybody bother with all that? And the answer seems to be your enemies. And your enemies are not lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, no. Your enemies are germs and parasites. That's what's going to get you. Germs and parasites. My first cousin's son died tragically from essentially the flu. This is not some story I heard about. It's my first cousin once removed. Because apparently the virus had the right genes to attack his genes. So when you have sex, you have a new set of genes. You have a new mixture. So people studied these top minnows, and they found that the ones who reproduced sexually had fewer parasites than the ones that reproduced on their own. This black spot disease. Wait, there's more. In these populations, with flooding and so on, with river ponds get isolated, then they dry up, then the river flows again. In between, some of the fish will have sex with other fish sometimes, and they'll have sex on their own, what's called asexually. And those fish, the ones that are in between, sometimes this, sometimes that, they have an intermediate number of infections. In other words, the explanation provided by evolution made a prediction. And the prediction's extraordinary and subtle, but there it is. How else would you explain it? And to Mr. Ham and his followers, I say this is something that we in science want. We want the ability to predict. And your assertion that there's some difference between the natural laws that I use to observe the world today and the natural laws that existed 4,000 years ago is extraordinary and unsettling. I travel around. I have a great many family members in Danville, Virginia, one of the U.S.'s most livable cities. It's lovely. And I was driving along, and there was a sign in front of a church, Big Bang Theory, you got to be kidding me, God. Now, everybody, why would someone at the church, a pastor, for example, put that sign up unless he or she didn't believe that the Big Bang was a real thing? I just want to review briefly with everybody why we accept, in the outside world, why we accept the Big Bang. Edwin Hubble, oh, sorry, there you go. You got to be kidding me, God. Edwin Hubble was sitting at Mount Wilson, which is up from Pasadena, California. On a clear day, you can look down and see where the Rose Parade goes. It's that close to civilization. But even in the early 1900s, the people who selected this site for astronomy picked an excellent site. The clouds and smog are below you. And Edwin Hubble sat there at this very big telescope night after night studying the heavens. And he found that the stars are moving apart. The stars are moving apart. And he wasn't sure why, but it was clear that the stars are moving farther and farther apart all the time. So people talked about it for a couple decades. And then eventually another astronomer, almost a couple decades, another astronomer, Fred Hoyle, just remarked, well, it was like there was a Big Bang. There was an explosion. This is to say, since everything's moving apart, it's very reasonable that at one time they were all together. And there's a place from whence these things expanded. And it was a remarkable insight. But people went still questioning it for decades. Science and conventional scientists questioning it for decades. These two researchers wanted to listen for radio signals from space, radio astronomy. And this is, while we have visible light for our eyes, there's a whole nother bunch of waves of light that are much longer. The microwaves in your oven are about that long. The radar at the airport is about that long. Your FM radio signals about like this. AM radio signals are a kilometer. They're several soccer fields. They went out listening, and there was this hiss, this tss, all the time that wouldn't go away. And they thought, oh, doggone it, there's some loose connector. They plugged in the connector. They re-screwed it, they made it tight. They turned it this way, the hiss was still there. They heard it that way, it's just still there. They thought it was pigeon droppings that had affected the reception of this horn, it's called. This thing is still there. It's in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. It's a National Historic Site. And Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson had found this cosmic background sound that was predicted by astronomers. Astronomers running the numbers, doing math, predicted that in the cosmos would be left over this echo, this energy from the Big Bang that would be detectable. And they detected it. We built the Cosmic Observatory for Background Emissions, the COBE spacecraft, and it matched exactly the astronomers' predictions. You got to respect that. It's a wonderful thing. Now, along that line is some interest in the age of the Earth. Right now, it's generally agreed that the Big Bang happened 13.7 billion years ago. What we can do on Earth, these elements that we all know on the periodic table of chemicals, even ones we don't know, were created when stars explode. And I look like nobody, but I attended a lecture by Hans Bethe, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering the process by which stars create all these elements. The one that interests me especially is our good friends rubidium and strontium. Rubidium becomes strontium spontaneously. It's an interesting thing to me. A neutron becomes a proton, and it goes up the periodic table. When lava comes out of the ground, molten lava, and it freezes, turns to rock, when the melt solidifies or crystallizes, it locks the rubidium and strontium in place. And so by careful assay, by being diligent, you can tell when the rock froze. You can tell how old the rubidium and strontium are, and you can get an age for the Earth. When that stuff falls on fossils, you can get a very good idea of how old the fossils are. I encourage you all to go to Nebraska, go to Ashfall State Park, and see the astonishing fossils. It looks like a Hollywood movie. There are rhinoceroses, there are three-toed horses in Nebraska. None of those animals are extant today. And they were buried catastrophically by a volcano in what is now Idaho, is now Yellowstone National Park. It's called the hot spot. People call it the super volcano. And it's a remarkable thing. Apparently, as I can tell you, as a Northwesterner around for Mount St. Helens, full disclosure, I'm on the Mount St. Helens board. When it goes off, it gives out a great deal of gas that's toxic and knocks these animals out. Looking for relief, they go to a watering hole, and then when the ash comes, they were all buried. It's an extraordinary place. Now, if in the bad old days you had heart problems, they would right away cut you open. Now we use a drug based on rubidium to look at the inside of your heart without cutting you open. Now, my Kentucky friends, I want you to consider this. Right now, there is no place in the Commonwealth of Kentucky to get a degree in this kind of nuclear medicine, this kind of drugs associated with that. I hope you find that troubling. I hope you're concerned about that. You want scientifically literate students in your Commonwealth for a better tomorrow for everybody. You can't get this here. You have to go out of state. Now, as far as the distance to stars, understand this is very well understood. It's February. We look at a star in February, we measure an angle to it, we wait 6 months, we look at that same star again, and we measure that angle. It's the same way carpenters built this building. It's the same way surveyors surveyed the land that we're standing on. And so by measuring the distance to a star, you can figure out how far away it is, that star, and then the stars beyond it and stars beyond that. There are billions of stars, more than 6,000 light years from here. A light year is a unit of distance, not a unit of time. There are billions of stars. Mr. Ham, how could there be billions of stars more distant than 6,000 years if the world's only 6,000 years old? It's an extraordinary claim. There's another astronomer, Adolf Kittel, who remarked first about the reasonable man. Is it reasonable that we have ice older by a factor of 100 than you claim the Earth is. We have trees that have more tree rings than the Earth is old. That we have rocks with rubidium and strontium and uranium and potassium argon dating that are far, far, far older than you claim the Earth is. Could anybody have built an ark that would sustain better than any ark anybody was able to build on the Earth? So if you're asking me, and I got the impression you were, is Ken Ham's creation model viable? I say no, absolutely not. Now, one last thing. You may not know that in the U.S. Constitution, from the Founding Fathers, is the sentence to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Kentucky voters, voters who might be watching online in places like Texas, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Kansas, please, you don't want to raise a generation of science students who don't understand how we know our place in the cosmos, our place in space, who don't understand natural law. We need to innovate to keep the United States where it is in the world. Thank you very much.
That's a lot to take in. I hope everybody's holding up well. It's a lot of information. What we're going to have now is a 5-minute rebuttal time for each gentleman to address the other one's comments, and then there will be a 5-minute counter-rebuttal after that. Things are going to start moving a little more quickly now, so at this point in particular, I want to make sure we don't have applauding or anything else going on that slows it down. So, Mr. Ham, if you'd like to begin with your 5-minute rebuttal first.
Well, first of all, Bill, if I was to answer all the points that you brought up, the moderator would think I was going on for millions of years. So I can only deal with some of them. And you mentioned the age of the Earth a couple of times, so let me deal with that. As I said in my presentation, you can't observe the age of the Earth, and I would say that comes under what we call historical origin science. Now, just to understand, so you understand where I'm coming from, yes, we admit we build our origins of historical science on the Bible. The Bible says God created in 6 days. The Hebrew word yom, as it's used in Genesis 1 with evening, morning number, means an ordinary day. Adam was made on day 6. And so when you add up all those genealogies specifically given in the Bible, yeah, from Adam to Abraham, you've got 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ, 2,000 years from Christ to the present 2,000 years. That's how we get 6,000 years. So that's where it comes from, just so you know. Now, a lot of people say, now, by the way, the Earth's age is 4.5 billion years old, and we have radioactive decay dating methods that found that. But you see, we certainly observe radioactive decay, whether it's rubidium, strontium, whether it's uranium, lead, potassium, argon. But when you're talking about the past, we have a problem. I'll give you a practical example. In Australia, there were engineers that were trying to search out about a coal mine, and so they drilled down and they found a basalt layer, lava flow, that had woody material in it, branches and twigs and so on. And when Dr. Andrew Snelling, our PhD geologist, sent that to a lab in Massachusetts in 1994, they used potassium argon dating. It dated to 45 million years old. Well, he also sent the wood to the radiocarbon section of the same lab, and that dated to 45,000 years old. 45,000-year-old wood and 45 million-year-old rock. The point is, there's a problem. Let me give you another example of a problem. There was a lava dome that started to form in the 80s after Mount St. Helens erupted. And in 1994, Dr. Steve Austin, another PhD geologist, actually sampled the rock there. He took whole rock, crushed it, sent it to the same lab, actually, I believe, and got a date of 0.35 million years. When he separated out the minerals, amphibole and pyroxene, and used potassium argon dating, you get 0.9 million, 2.8 million. My point is, all these dating methods actually give all sorts of different dates. In fact, different dating methods on the same rock we can give all sorts of different dates. See, there's lots of assumptions in regard to radioactive dating. Number one, for instance, the amounts of the parent and daughter isotopes at the beginning when the rock formed, you have to know them, but you weren't there. See, that's historical science. Assumption two, that all daughter atoms measured today must have only been derived in situ radioactive decay of parent atoms. In other words, it's a closed system, but you don't know that, and there's a lot of evidence that that's not so. Assumption number 3, that the decay rates have remained a constant. And they're just some of them. There's others as well. The point is there's lots of assumptions in regard to the dating method. So there's no dating method you can use that you can absolutely age date a rock. There's all sorts of differences out there. And I do want to address the bit you brought up about Christians believing in millions of years. Yeah, there's a lot of Christians out there that believe in millions of years, but I'd say they have a problem. I'm not saying they're not Christians, but because salvation is conditioned upon faith in Christ, not the age of the earth, but there's an inconsistency with what the Bible teaches. If you believe in millions of years, you've got death and bloodshed, suffering, disease, over millions of years leading to man, because that's what you see in the fossil record. The Bible makes it very clear death is a result of man's sin. In fact, the first death was in the garden when God killed an animal, clothed Adam and Eve, first blood sacrifice, pointing towards what would happen with Jesus Christ, who would be the one who would be die once and for all. Now, if you believe in millions of years as a Christian, in the fossil record, there's evidence of animals eating each other. The Bible says originally all the animals and man were vegetarian. We weren't told we could eat meat until after the flood. There's diseases represented in the fossil record, like brain tumours, but the Bible says when God made everything, it was very good. God doesn't call brain tumours very good. There's fossilised thorns in the fossil record. Said to be hundreds of millions of years old. The Bible says thorns came after the curse. So these two things can't be true at the same time. And you know what? There's hundreds of dating methods out there, hundreds of them. Actually, 90% of them contradict billions of years. And the point is, all such dating methods are fallible. And I claim there's only one infallible dating method. It's a witness who was there, who knows everything, who told us. And that's from the Word of God. And that's why I would say that the Earth is only 6,000 years. And as Dr. Faulkner said, there's nothing in astronomy, and certainly Dr. Snelling would say there's nothing in geology to contradict a belief in a young age for the Earth and the universe.
Thank you, Mr. Ham. Mr. Nye, your 5-minute rebuttal, please.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the beginning. If you find 45-million-year-old rock on top of 45,000-year-old trees, maybe the rock slid on top. Maybe that's it. That seems much more reasonable explanation than it's impossible. As far as dating goes, actually the methods are very reliable. One of the mysteries or interesting things that people in my business, especially at the Planetary Society, are interested in is why all the asteroids seem to be so close to the same date. It's in an age, 4.5, 4.6 billion years. It's a remarkable thing. People at first expected a little more of a spread. So I understand that you take the Bible as written in English, translated not countless, but many, many times over the last 3 millennia, as to be a more accurate, more reasonable assessment of the natural laws we see around us than what I and everybody in here can observe. That to me is unsettling, troubling. And then about the disease thing, are the fish sinners? Have they done something wrong to get diseases? That's sort of an extraordinary claim that takes me just a little past what I'm comfortable with. And then as far as you can't observe the past, I have to stop you right there. That's what we do in astronomy. All we can do is in astronomy is look at the past. By the way, you're looking at the past right now because the speed of light bounces off of me and then gets to your eyes. And I'm delighted to see that the people in the back of the room appear just that much younger than the people in the front. So this idea that you can separate the natural laws of the past from the natural laws that we have now, I think is at the heart of our disagreement. I don't see how we're ever going to agree with that if you insist that natural laws have changed. It's, for lack of a better word, it's magical. And I have appreciated magic since I was a kid, but it's not really what we want in conventional mainstream science. So your assertion that all the animals were vegetarians before they got on the ark, that's really remarkable. I have not spent a lot of time with lions, but I can tell they've got teeth that really aren't set up for broccoli. that these animals were vegetarians till this flood is something that I would ask you to provide a little more proof for. I give you the lion's teeth. You give me verses as translated into English over, 30 centuries? So that is not enough evidence for me. If you've ever played telephone, I remember very well in kindergarten, where you have a secret and you whisper it to the next person, to the next person, to the next person. Things often go wrong. So it's very reasonable to me that instead of lions being vegetarians on the ark, lions are lions, and the information that you use to create your worldview is not consistent with what I as a reasonable man would expect. So I want everybody to consider the implications of this. If we accept Mr. Ham's point of view, that Mr. Ham's point of view, that the Bible as translated into American English serves as a science text, and that he and his followers will interpret that for you, I want you to consider what that means. It means that Mr. Ham's word, or his interpretation of these other words, is somehow to be more respected than what you can observe in nature, what you can find literally in your backyard in Kentucky. It's a troubling and unsettling point of view, and it's one I'd very much like you to address when you come back. As far as the 5 races that you mentioned, it's kind of the same thing. The 5 races were claimed by people who were of European descent, and they said, hey, we're the best, check us out. And that turns out to be, if you've ever traveled anywhere or done anything, not to be that way. People are much more alike than they are different. So are we supposed to take your word for English words translated over the last 30 centuries instead of what we can observe in the universe around us?
Very good. And Mr. Ham, would you like to offer your 5-minute counter-rebuttal?
First of all, Bill, just so I just don't want a misunderstanding here, and that is the 45,000-year-old wood, or supposedly 45,000, was inside the basalt. So it was encased in the basalt, and that's why I was making that particular point. And I would also say that natural law hasn't changed. As I talked about, I said we have the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, and that only makes